here is something that may genuinely surprise you. The dream of building a thinking machine is older than electricity, older than the steam engine, older than the printing press. Long before anyone knew what a computer was, people imagined objects that could move, speak, obey, and perhaps even think. So the history of artificial intelligence does not begin in a laboratory or a Silicon Valley garage. It begins with myths, mechanical wonders, and a question that humanity has never been able to leave alone. Can we create something that has a mind of its own? Settle in. There is no need to hurry. We are going to follow that question across thousands of years, from bronze giants and clockwork servants to neural networks and generative AI. Along the way, we will meet brilliant people, failed ideas, astonishing recoveries, and more than one moment when the future arrived much earlier than anyone expected. The ancient Greeks imagined some of the earliest artificial beings in recorded history. In their mythology, Hephaestus, god of fire and metalworking, did more than forge weapons. He created mechanical servants of gold that could move, speak, and assist him. In some versions of the myths, his divine craftsmanship was also connected with Talos, a giant bronze guardian that patrolled the island of Crete and attacked approaching ships. These were myths, not engineering diagrams, but they expressed a powerful intuition. If matter could be arranged with enough skill, perhaps it could behave as though it were alive. The ancient world also produced real machines that imitated living things. Around the 3rd century BCE, Ctesibius of Alexandria built water clocks, hydraulic organs, and mechanical birds that could sing. Centuries later, Hero of Alexandria described devices powered by water, steam, air pressure, weights, and carefully arranged ropes. One of his most remarkable designs was a miniature theater in which figures moved through a complete performance without anyone visibly controlling them. The figures were not intelligent. They could not change the story or respond to the audience, but the sequence of their movements had been encoded into the mechanism. The machine followed instructions stored in its physical design. That simple idea is one of the deepest roots of computing. A system can contain a program, and once started, it can carry out that program by itself. The same idea appeared again during the Islamic Golden Age. In the early 13th century, the engineer Ismail al-Jazari described elaborate water clocks, fountains, mechanical servants, and musical automata. Some used pegs placed on rotating drums to control when different actions occurred. Change the positions of the pegs, and you changed the performance. It was a mechanical form of programmability. The intelligence still belonged entirely to the designer, but the behavior could now be altered without rebuilding the whole machine. For most of history, these artificial creatures were bodies without minds. They moved, played music, poured water, and performed rituals. But during the 17th century, European philosophers began to ask whether thought itself might also be mechanical. René Descartes lived in an age fascinated by lifelike automata. He believed the bodies of animals operated like extraordinarily complex machines. Yet he drew a firm line around the human mind. A machine might repeat words, he argued, but it could never use language flexibly enough to respond appropriately to every new situation. True conversation required a rational soul. Language remains one of AI's central tests. Descartes believed a machine would reveal its emptiness when conversation moved beyond prepared responses. Centuries later, chatbots would reverse the question. If conversation feels intelligent, what is missing? The debate remained philosophical until the 19th century, when Charles Babbage designed a machine that made programmable thought feel less imaginary. Babbage was an English mathematician frustrated by errors in hand-calculated tables. His greater ambition was the analytical engine, conceived in the 1830s. It would contain a memory called the store, a processing unit called the mill, and punched card instructions. It could repeat operations and choose different paths according to earlier results. In other words, it was a design for a general purpose, programmable computer, created more than a century before electronic computers became practical. Babbage never completed it. The machine required thousands of precision-made parts, and the engineering resources of his time were not sufficient. But the design itself was sound. More importantly, it attracted the attention of someone who understood its meaning more deeply than almost anyone else. Her name was Ada Lovelace. Lovelace, the mathematically gifted daughter of Lord Byron, realized that the analytical engine was not merely a faster calculator. Numbers inside it could represent musical notes, symbols, or any information expressible through formal rules. In 1843, she published extensive notes about the engine. Among them was a detailed method for calculating Bernoulli numbers, often described as the first published computer program. But the most important part of her writing was philosophical. Lovelace argued that the engine had no power to originate anything. It could perform whatever humans knew how to instruct it to perform, but it could not create its own intentions or discover truths independently. This became known as Lady Lovelace's objection, and it has never really disappeared. Yet she also imagined that a machine might one day compose elaborate music. If the relationships between sounds could be expressed through rules, the engine might manipulate those relationships and produce a composition. The result could appear creative even if the machine itself felt nothing. That tension sits at the center of artificial intelligence. A machine may generate something new to us while still operating according to a process designed by others. Is that creativity? Is it imitation? Is the difference about the result, the process, or the presence of an inner experience? By the middle of the 19th century, the major pieces of the puzzle were already visible. Humanity had imagined artificial beings. Engineers had built programmable mechanisms. Philosophers had asked whether minds were machines. Babbage had designed a general computer, and Lovelace had seen that such a machine could manipulate symbols as well as numbers. What was missing was a precise definition of computation, and a machine powerful enough to make the question real. Both would arrive through the work of Alan Turing. Turing was born in London in 1912. As a young mathematician at Cambridge, he became interested in a problem that seemed remote from machines, war, or intelligence. It concerned the limits of mathematics itself. The German mathematician David Hilbert had asked whether there could be a definite mechanical procedure for deciding the truth or falsity of any mathematical statement. The wording mattered. What exactly was a mechanical procedure? What did it mean to calculate something by following rules? In 1936, at the age of 23, Turing answered by imagining an extremely simple device. Picture an endless tape divided into squares. Each square can contain a symbol. A reading head examines one square at a time. Depending on the symbol it sees and the machine's current state, it can replace the symbol, move one square left or right, and change state. Then it repeats the process. This imaginary device became known as the Turing machine. It sounds almost too simple to matter. Yet, Turing showed that a machine built from these basic actions could perform any calculation that could be expressed as an effective procedure. More remarkably, he described a universal machine that could read the encoded instructions of any other machine and simulate it. That is the essential idea of the modern computer. The same physical device can become a calculator, a word processor, a chess player, or a neural network because the program itself is stored as data. Turing's paper also established that computation has limits. Some questions cannot be solved by any general algorithm. His famous halting problem asks whether a procedure can always determine in advance if another program will eventually stop or continue forever. Turing proved that no such universal procedure exists. This result ended Hilbert's hope for a complete mechanical method that could settle every mathematical question. But in defining the limits of machines, Turing also defined their extraordinary reach. If one universal machine could simulate any possible computation, then a new question became unavoidable. Could the processes of a human mind also be simulated? Was thinking something beyond computation, or simply a form of computation too complicated to understand? Before Turing could explore that question fully, Europe went to war. In 1939, he joined the British code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park. The German military used the Enigma machine to encrypt messages by passing electrical signals through rotating wheels. The settings changed constantly, creating an enormous number of possible keys. The first major breakthroughs against Enigma had come from Polish mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosiecki, and Henryk Zygalski. Their work was shared with Britain and France, giving the Allied effort a crucial foundation. At Bletchley Park, Turing helped design the Bombay, an electromechanical machine that tested possible Enigma settings. It did not simply try every possibility blindly. Using likely fragments of plain text and the logical structure of Enigma, it searched for contradictions and eliminated impossible configurations. The Bombay was not an intelligent machine. It followed rules designed by humans. Yet, from the outside, it performed something that looked like reasoning, exploring possibilities, rejecting inconsistent ones, and narrowing a vast problem to a manageable answer. The code-breaking work at Bletchley Park contributed enormously to the Allied war effort. It also gave Turing direct experience of machines carrying out intellectual tasks at a scale and speed no team of humans could match. After the war, he worked on early electronic computers, including the automatic computing engine and the Manchester machines. These were no longer imaginary tapes. They were physical systems built from electronic components, capable of storing instructions and changing tasks. In 1950, Turing returned openly to the question that had been waiting beneath his mathematical work. He published a paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Its opening sentence was simple. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? Then he immediately changed the question. Words such as machine and think were too vague, he argued. Instead of debating definitions forever, he proposed a behavioral test. A human judge would exchange written messages with two hidden participants, one human and one machine. If the judge could not reliably tell them apart, the machine would be said to succeed in the imitation game. Today we call it the Turing test. Turing was not claiming that successful imitation would prove consciousness. He was asking what evidence we actually use when judging the minds of others. We cannot directly inspect another person's inner experience. We infer intelligence from language and behavior. If a machine behaved with the same flexibility, why should it be judged by an entirely different standard? The paper anticipated many objections that still appear in arguments about AI. Some argued that thinking required a soul. Others pointed to mathematical limits as proof that machines could never match human intelligence. Turing replied that humans also make mistakes and encounter limits. Against Lovelace's objection, he noted that machines can surprise their creators, and humans may follow processes they do not understand. Most importantly, he suggested two broad paths toward machine intelligence. One was to program an adult mind from the top down, give the machine facts, rules, and methods of reasoning. The other was to construct what he called a child machine, a simpler system that could be educated through experience. This distinction would shape the next 70 years of AI. One tradition tried to write intelligence as explicit rules. The other tried to build systems that learned. Turing did not live to see either approach mature. In 1952, he was prosecuted in Britain for homosexuality. He was given a choice between imprisonment and hormonal treatment. He chose the treatment. On June 7, 1954, he was found dead at the age of 41. The official ruling was suicide, though questions about the circumstances have remained. The loss is difficult to measure. Turing had helped define computation, design early computers, break wartime codes, and frame machine intelligence as a serious scientific problem. Yet the country he served destroyed his career and subjected him to punishment for who he was. Decades later, Britain formally apologized. Turing received a posthumous royal pardon, and his image eventually appeared on the 50-pound note. None of that could restore the years he was denied, but his ideas survived. By the early 1950s, computers existed. They were enormous, expensive, and primitive, but they could store programs and manipulate symbols. Around the United States and Britain, mathematicians, psychologists, electrical engineers, and neurologists began asking whether these machines might do more than calculate. They were working separately, using different terms, and pursuing different methods. Soon, one small summer workshop would give their shared ambition a name. The person who chose that name was John McCarthy. McCarthy was a young mathematician who believed machine intelligence should be treated not merely as philosophy, but as an engineering project. In 1955, he joined Marvin Minsky, information theorist Claude Shannon, and IBM researcher Nathaniel Rochester in proposing a summer research meeting at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. Their proposal used a new phrase, artificial intelligence. McCarthy chose the term deliberately. Other researchers spoke of cybernetics, automata, or complex information processing. Artificial intelligence made a bolder claim. The goal was not simply to imitate intelligent behavior or study control systems. The goal was to understand intelligence well enough to build it. The workshop took place in the summer of 1956. Its later reputation makes it sound like a grand ceremony where a new science was founded in a single moment. The reality was less tidy. Researchers arrived and left at different times. They disagreed about methods. No unified manifesto emerged, but the meeting gave the field a name, a network, and a shared sense of possibility. Several participants had already built systems that appeared to cross old boundaries. Arthur Samuel at IBM created a checkers program that improved through experience. Rather than giving it a perfect strategy, he gave it a way to evaluate positions and allowed it to play many games, including games against itself. Its judgments changed according to what led to victory or defeat. Eventually, it became strong enough to challenge skilled amateurs. Marvin Minsky had built the SNARK, an early hardware neural network assembled partly from surplus military components. It modeled a collection of simple neuron-like units and adjusted connections while learning to navigate a simulated maze. Alan Newell and Herbert Simon, working with programmer Cliff Shaw, created the logic theorist. The program proved mathematical theorems from Principia Mathematica, and in one case found a proof considered more elegant than the published version. These systems were limited, but the direction of travel seemed unmistakable. In only a few years, computers had begun to learn games, prove theorems, and perform logical search. Many researchers concluded that human-level intelligence could not be far away. The predictions became extraordinary. Newell and Simon expected a computer to become world chess champion within about a decade and anticipated machines making important mathematical discoveries. Simon later suggested that machines would soon perform any work a human could do. They were wrong about the timing, but their optimism was not foolish. The first problems attempted by AI had fallen surprisingly quickly. From the perspective of 1958, it was tempting to imagine progress continuing at the same rate. They did not yet understand that formal logic and board games have explicit rules, while everyday life does not. A child can recognize a face, navigate a room, or expect a dropped egg to break. Programming that ordinary understanding proved harder than proving a theorem. This reversal would become one of AI's most important lessons. The abilities that feel effortless to us often depend on enormous stores of knowledge and subtle perception accumulated through years of living in the world. During the 1960s, research money flowed, much of it from the American military. Laboratories at MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, and elsewhere explored language, robotics, planning, games, and mathematical reasoning. The dominant approach became symbolic AI. Symbolic AI treated intelligence as the manipulation of explicit symbols according to rules. A system represented facts about a problem, compared its present state with a goal, and searched for a sequence of actions that connected them. Newell and Simon's general problem solver used a method called means-ends analysis. It examined the difference between the current state and the desired state, selected an operation that reduced that difference, and created smaller sub-goals when the operation could not yet be applied. Inside carefully defined problems, this worked beautifully. The system could solve logic exercises and puzzles. Researchers hoped the same architecture might eventually explain human reasoning itself. But real life resisted neat formalization. A program can reason only with what it has been given. Ordinary understanding depends on unstated knowledge. Cups contain liquids, ropes pull rather than push, and hidden objects still exist. Humans carry millions of assumptions like these without noticing. Writing all of them as rules is almost impossible. Worse, the rules interact, depend on context and have exceptions. SHRDLU, created by Terry Winograd around 1970, demonstrated both the power and limitation of symbolic AI. In a simulated world of colored blocks and a robotic arm, it followed typed instructions, answered questions, and explained previous actions. Within its tiny world, SHRDLU was remarkable. It connected language to objects, goals, and actions. But its understanding did not extend beyond that carefully constructed environment. The system knew blocks because every relevant fact about blocks had been explicitly represented. The open world contained too many objects, meanings, ambiguities, and unstated assumptions. This pattern appeared repeatedly: a dazzling performance in a narrow domain, followed by failure when the boundaries were widened. At the same time, another program was revealing a different problem, not with machine reasoning, but with human perception of machines. Between 1964 and 1966, Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT created ELIZA. Its best-known script imitated a Rogerian psychotherapist, a style of therapy in which the therapist often reflects a patient's words and asks open questions. If a user typed, "I am unhappy," ELIZA might answer, "Why do you say you are unhappy?" If the user mentioned a mother, the program might ask about family. It searched for keywords, rearranged phrases, and selected responses from prepared patterns. ELIZA did not understand sadness, family, fear, or love. It had no model of the person speaking to it. Its apparent empathy was produced by simple transformations of text. Yet users responded as though someone were listening. Weizenbaum's own secretary knew it was a program and had watched him create it. Still, after beginning a conversation with ELIZA, she asked him to leave the room so she could continue in private. Weizenbaum was disturbed. He intended ELIZA partly as a demonstration of how shallow computer conversation could be. Instead, people treated the illusion of understanding as understanding itself. Some professionals even imagined computerized therapists replacing human ones. The experience transformed Weizenbaum into a critic of the field. He argued that the question was not only what computers could do, but what decisions human beings should allow them to make. ELIZA exposed a tendency that remains powerful today. When a machine uses language in socially familiar ways, people supply the missing mind. We imagine intention, sympathy, confidence, and personality behind words generated by a mechanism. The machine may be limited, but our instinct to relate to it is not. While symbolic systems were attracting attention, the learning-based tradition continued along a more uncertain path. In 1958, psychologist Frank Rosenblatt introduced the perceptron. Inspired by biological neurons, it received several inputs, assigned each one a weight, combined them, and produced an output. When it made an incorrect classification, its weights could be adjusted. Given enough examples, the machine learned a boundary between categories without a programmer writing the classification rule directly. The press responded with wild predictions. Reports suggested that future perceptrons might walk, speak, reproduce, or become conscious. The actual system could identify simple patterns, but the underlying idea was profound. Useful behavior could be learned from data rather than specified line by line. Then, in 1969, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert published Perceptrons, a rigorous analysis of what these systems could and could not do. They showed that a single layer perceptron, could not represent certain simple relationships, including the logical XOR function. The mathematics was correct. The wider conclusion drawn by the research community was far more damaging. Networks with hidden layers could overcome many of these limitations, but no reliable training method for such networks had yet gained acceptance. Minsky and Papert doubted that multilayer systems would become practical. Funding agencies took the critique as evidence that neural networks were a dead end. Research money disappeared. Careers shifted. The symbolic approach became dominant while neural networks entered a long period of neglect. Rosenblatt died in a boating accident in 1971 on his 43rd birthday. He never saw multilayer neural networks return and solve the problem that had helped bury his field. By the early 1970s, artificial intelligence had produced impressive demonstrations, but not the flexible machine intelligence Sochers had promised, that researchers had promised. The distance between a block's world and the real world remained enormous. Funders began asking what decades of optimism had actually delivered. The answer would bring the first AI winter. In Britain, the turning point came in 1973, when mathematician James Lighthill delivered a government report on the state of AI research. His judgment was severe. The field had made much less progress toward general intelligence than its advocates claimed, and many of its successes worked only in small, artificial environments. One central obstacle was combinatorial explosion. A planning system might have only a few choices at each step, yet after many steps, the number of possible paths grows beyond anything a computer can search. Add the uncertainty and ambiguity of the real world, and the problem becomes overwhelming. The Lighthill report led to major cuts in British funding. In the United States, military agencies also became less willing to support open-ended promises. Researchers were asked for practical results and shorter schedules. The first AI winter had begun. The name captures the mood. Funding contracted, laboratories shrank, and artificial intelligence became a label some researchers avoided. The field did not disappear, but its grand ambitions became harder to defend. Yet winters can force people to concentrate on what actually works. At Stanford, Edward Feigenbaum promoted a more modest idea. Instead of trying to build one machine that could reason about everything, why not build a system containing the knowledge of an expert in one restricted field? These programs became known as expert systems. Their knowledge was usually stored as collections of rules. If certain conditions were present, the system would draw a conclusion or recommend an action. A knowledge engineer interviewed specialists, extracted their methods and rules of thumb, translated them into a form the computer could use. Dendril, developed with chemist Joshua Lederberg and others, analyzed mass spectrometry data to infer the structures of organic molecules. It performed a real scientific task and was used by working chemists. Mycin, developed in the early 1970s, diagnosed certain bacterial infections and recommended antibiotics. In evaluations, its recommendations compared surprisingly well with those of physicians in its narrow specialty, although legal and practical concerns kept it from routine clinical use. The commercial breakthrough was XCON-N, also known as R1, created at Carnegie Mellon for Digital Equipment Corporation. Configuring a large VAX computer system required selecting and arranging many compatible parts. Mistakes were expensive. XCon encoded the knowledge of experienced configurators and eventually saved the company tens of millions of dollars each year. Now, AI was not merely performing demonstrations, it was saving money. Corporate interest returned. Companies purchased expert system tools and created internal AI groups. Japan announced its ambitious fifth generation computer systems project in 1982, promising advanced machines built around logic programming. Governments in the United States and Britain feared being left behind and invested heavily again. The field entered another boom, but expert systems carried the weakness of symbolic AI into commercial sources. They knew only what had been manually encoded. They could not easily learn from new experience or adapt to unusual cases. A system built for one hospital, factory, or geological region could fail when moved somewhere else. Extracting knowledge from experts was slow. Human specialists often could not clearly explain the subtle judgments they had developed through experience. Even when the rules were captured, maintaining thousands of interacting rules became expensive. Every new product, regulation, or scientific discovery could require extensive revisions. The systems were powerful inside their boundaries and brittle outside them. By the late 1980s, the market began to collapse. Specialized AI hardware lost its advantage as ordinary workstations became cheaper and faster. Companies discovered that many expert systems cost more to maintain than expected. Japan's fifth generation project failed to produce the promised revolution. Around 1987, a second AI winter arrived. Once again, the field had mistaken success in a restricted domain for a clear path to general intelligence. Once again, expectations rose faster than the technology could support. But during the boom and the collapse, a small group of researchers had been working on the approach that almost vanished after Minsky and Papert's critique. Neural networks were about to return. One of the most persistent people in that revival was Geoffrey Hinton. Hinton studied psychology and artificial intelligence, but he became convinced that symbolic rules were not the natural path to intelligence. Human beings do not learn to see, speak, or recognize faces by receiving enormous lists of logical instructions. The brain changes through experience. Hinton believed artificial systems should do something similar. This was an unfashionable position. Through the 1970s and early 1980s, neural networks were associated with an approach the field had already rejected. Funding was scarce, and researchers risked their careers by staying with it. The central technical obstacle was training a multi-layer network. In a simple perceptron, an error at the output can be connected directly to the weights that produced it. In a deep network, many hidden layers contribute to the final answer. When the system is wrong, which of perhaps millions of connections deserves the blame? The solution became known as backpropagation. The mathematical foundations had appeared in several places. Seppo Linnainmaa described an efficient form of automatic differentiation. Paul Werbos proposed using related ideas to train neural networks in his 1974 doctoral work. But the method attracted little attention, while neural networks remained unpopular. In 1986, David Rumelhart, Geoffrey Hinton, and Ronald Williams published a clear and influential demonstration of backpropagation in multi-layer networks. The basic idea is intuitive, even if the mathematics is not. Imagine a long assembly line that produces a faulty object. Instead of blaming only the final worker, You trace the error backward through every stage and estimate how much each earlier action contributed. Then, every worker makes a small correction. A neural network produces an answer, measures its error, and sends that information backward. Each weight changes slightly in the direction that reduces the error. Repeated across many examples, these corrections create internal representations no programmer explicitly designed. This was exactly what single-layer perceptrons lacked. A hidden layer could learn intermediate features, and additional layers could combine simple patterns into more complex ones. The connectionist revival produced memorable demonstrations. NetTalk, created by Terence Sejnowski and Charles Rosenberg, learned to pronounce English words from written text. Early in training, its speech sounded like confused noise. Gradually, recognizable pronunciation emerged. Listening to the improvement felt less like watching a fixed program and more like watching a skill develop. Jan LeCun, who worked with Hinton and others, developed convolutional neural networks for visual recognition. Their structure allowed the same pattern detectors to be applied across different parts of an image. By the 1990s, LeCun's systems were reading handwritten numbers on bank checks, a practical application used at large scale. Still, neural networks had serious limits. Computers were slow, datasets were small, and deep networks were difficult to train. As error signals passed backward through many layers, they often became too weak to guide learning, a problem known as vanishing gradients. Traditional statistical methods, such as support vector machines, frequently matched or exceeded neural networks while being easier to analyze. By the late 1990s, neural networks again appeared to be losing the argument. Hinton did not abandon them. He continued at the University of Toronto, working with a small community that believed larger networks could discover useful representation. If researchers found better training methods and enough computing power. Around 2006, Hinton and Ruslan Salakutdinov showed that deep networks could be trained more effectively by first learning one layer at a time and then refining the whole system. Other improvements followed. Researchers began using the phrase deep learning. The results were promising. But the event that transformed the field did not happen in a philosophical debate or a robotics laboratory. It happened in an image recognition competition. ImageNet was a vast collection of labeled photographs organized into 1,000 categories. Each year, research teams competed to build systems that could classify the images accurately. Progress had been steady but slow, usually measured in small improvements. In 2012, Hinton and two of his students, Alex Krzyzewski and Ilya Sutskever, entered a deep convolutional network called AlexNet. AlexNet had 8 learned layers and roughly 60 million adjustable parameters. Krzyzewski trained it on graphics processing units, or GPUs, chips, designed for video games, whose parallel mathematics made them exceptionally effective for neural networks. AlexNet did not merely win. Its error rate was dramatically lower than that of the next best system. The gap was so large that it changed what the entire computer vision community believed was possible. Within a few years, deep networks replaced most competing methods in major image recognition contests. Similar techniques improved speech recognition, translation, medical imaging, and many other tasks. Three forces had finally converged. The internet provided enormous datasets. GPUs provided enough computing power. Decades of algorithmic work made deep networks trainable and stable. None of the ingredients was entirely new. The revolution came from their combination. For Hinton, AlexNet was the payoff to more than 30 years of persistence. He had continued when neural networks were dismissed, unfunded, and frequently renamed simply to make the work seem respectable. Now the approach once treated as a historical mistake was becoming the foundation of modern AI. Networks quickly grew deeper. In 2015, residual networks introduced shortcut connections that allowed learning signals to travel through very deep architectures. A system called ResNet used more than 100 layers and achieved image recognition performance that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. But labeling photographs was still a narrow task. Could learning systems display strategy, judgment, or something that resembled intuition? The ancient game of Go offered a severe test. Its rules are simple, but the number of possible positions is beyond exhaustive search. For decades, strong Go programs remained far behind strong human players. In March 2016, DeepMind's AlphaGo played a 5-game match against Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players in the world. AlphaGo combined neural networks with search and reinforcement learning. It studied human games, then strengthened itself through repeated play. The most famous moment came during the second game. On move 37, AlphaGo placed a stone in a position so unusual that professional commentators initially suspected an error. Human experts assigned very low probability to such a move. Yet as the game unfolded, its purpose became clear. The move was not a mistake. It was a powerful strategic choice that helped AlphaGo win. Move 37 became a symbol of machine creativity. The system had not violated the rules or received a mystical insight. It had evaluated patterns through a form of learning different from human tradition and found a possibility that experts had largely ignored. The moment was unsettling because it did not look like simple imitation. It looked like an alien form of intuition. AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol 4 games to 1. A later version, AlphaGo Zero, began without studying human matches. Given only the rules, it played against itself and surpassed the original system. AlphaZero extended the same general approach to chess and shogi. These were extraordinary achievements, but games remain closed worlds. They have clear rules, complete information, and unambiguous goals. Human language is more open, uncertain, and tangled with the entire world. The next breakthrough began with a paper published by Google researchers in 2017. Attention is all you need. Before then, language systems often relied on recurrent neural networks, which processed text step by step while maintaining a memory of earlier words. They could work well, but the sequential process was slow and made distant relationships difficult to preserve. The new architecture, called the transformer, used self-attention. Instead of carrying information through a sentence, one word at a time, the model could examine relationships among all its words more directly. For each part of a sentence, it learned which other parts mattered most. In the sentence, the animal did not cross the street because it was tired. Attention helps connect it with animal. In a long passage, the same mechanism can link ideas separated by many sentences. Because many attention calculations can occur in parallel, transformers could also be trained efficiently on large computing systems. The architecture became the basis of a new generation of language models. In 2018, OpenAI introduced GPT, the generative pre-trained transformer. Its training objective was simple: predict the next piece of text. The model read large amounts of writing, guessed what came next, compared its guess with the actual text, and adjusted its weights. Next token prediction sounds modest, almost like autocomplete. Yet to predict language well, a model benefits from learning grammar, style, facts, relationships, and recurring patterns of reasoning. Pre-training was crucial. Instead of creating a separate system from scratch for every task, researchers could train one large model on general text and then adapt it or guide it for many purposes. GPT-2 generated longer, more coherent passages. The much larger GPT-3 displayed an unexpected ability to follow tasks described in a prompt. With a few examples, it could translate, summarize, answer questions, imitate styles, and write basic code without separate retraining. Researchers debated whether these were truly emergent abilities or whether smooth improvements merely looked sudden because of the tests being used. But the practical effect was clear. Increasing scale produced capabilities that the model's designers had not programmed individually. Other transformer families followed. BERT became influential for language understanding. Google, Meta, Anthropic, and many research groups developed their own large models. The competition intensified. Then, in November 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT. The original version was built on GPT 3.5 and refined to follow instructions and sustain conversations. One important method was reinforcement learning from human feedback. Human evaluators compared model responses, and the system learned which kinds of answers people preferred. The interface made advanced language modeling feel simple. Anyone could ask for an explanation, an email, a story, a piece of code, or help exploring an idea. In early 2023, a UBS analysis based on traffic estimates from SimilarWeb suggested that ChatGPT had reached roughly 100 million monthly active users in January, about 2 months after launch. That was an outside estimate, rather than an audited user count published by OpenAI, but it still captured the extraordinary speed of the service's early adoption. AI was no longer something most people encountered only through recommendations or search results. They were speaking to it directly. The connection to Eliza was impossible to miss. Both invited people to imagine a mind behind generated words. But Eliza rearranged a few patterns, while large language models learned statistical structures from vast collections of text and responded across thousands of subjects. While that competition intensified between Google, Meta, and OpenAI, a small group of former OpenAI researchers had quietly chosen a different path. In December of 2020, Dario Amodei, then OpenAI's vice president of research, left the company along with his sister Daniela, who had led safety and policy work there. Within a few months, about a dozen other researchers joined them. They met mostly over video calls, since the world was still deep in the pandemic, and weekly lunches in a small park near their offices became one of the few places the growing team gathered in person. The new company needed a name. An early planning document, later shared publicly, listed candidates including Aligned AI, Sponge, Sloth, and Swan Systems. The team eventually settled on Anthropic, partly because it suggested a human-centered approach to the technology, and partly, by their own admission, because the domain name happened to be available. they incorporated as a public benefit corporation, a structure that legally commits a company to a stated mission alongside its pursuit of profit. Anthropic spent its first 18 months almost entirely on research, deliberately avoiding any public product. When the company finished training its first large language model in the summer of 2022, it chose not to release it immediately, citing a wish to avoid accelerating a race toward more powerful but less understood systems. Months later, after a different company released ChatGPT and changed public expectations overnight, Anthropic adjusted course and began shipping its own assistant, Claude. The name was an internal nod to Claude Shannon, the mathematician whose theory of information had quietly underpinned computing for decades. Anthropic's central technical contribution was a training method called constitutional AI. Instead of relying only on human reviewers ranking responses, researchers wrote out a document of principles, borrowing language from sources as different as the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and ordinary terms of service agreements. The model was then trained to critique and revise its own answers according to that written constitution, judging itself against explicit rules rather than only against whatever human raters happened to prefer on a given day. Claude grew through a sequence of model families, each one given a literary name. The Opus tier represented the largest and most capable models. Sonnet offered a balance of intelligence and speed, and Haiku traded some capability for near-instant responses. Each generation pushed further into a particular kind of usefulness, not just answering questions, but using tools, browsing the web, writing and running code, and working through long, multi-step tasks with limited supervision. One of the more unexpected developments came from inside the company itself. Anthropic's own engineers had built an internal command line tool to let Claude read, edit, and run code directly inside a programmer's own project, largely as a convenience for testing new models against real engineering work. Released externally as Claude Code, the tool found an audience far beyond Anthropic's walls, and within roughly half a year of its public release, it had grown into a substantial product in its own right, used not only by professional software engineers but by analysts, researchers, and people automating ordinary office tasks who had never written a line of code before. By 2026, a new and quieter chapter had begun. Internally, and through a small number of trusted partners under an arrangement called Project Glasswing, Anthropic had been testing models more capable than its public Opus line, a tier it named Mythos. Access to it remained deliberately limited and was further restricted under a government export control directive in the summer of that year. The episode illustrated something industry by then. The most capable systems in existence were not always the ones available to the public. And the gap between what could be built and what should be released had become its own continuing negotiation. GPT-4 was announced in March 2023 as a multimodal model designed to accept both text and image inputs. At launch, however, image input remained a limited research preview rather than a broadly available ChatGPT feature. Wider access to image conversations arrived later that year. At the same time, diffusion models generated pictures from written descriptions, while other systems began producing music, speech, and video. Machines could now create outputs that appeared original in almost every major medium. The race was no longer confined to one company or even one country. Inside Google, two once separate research groups, Google Brain and DeepMind, the same DeepMind whose AlphaGo program had defeated Lee Sedol, were merged in 2023, specifically to compete in this new arena. Their combined model family, Gemini, was designed from the outset to handle text, images, audio, and video together, rather than treating each as a separate add-on. Successive versions arrived at a pace that would have seemed unthinkable a decade earlier, each one folding in stronger reasoning, longer context windows capable of holding entire books or code bases at once, and increasingly capable autonomous agents able to carry out extended tasks with minimal supervision. One of Google's image generation tools picked up the affectionate nickname Nano Banana among the people who used it daily, a small reminder that even frontier technology accumulates ordinary human names. A more disruptive entrant arrived from an unexpected direction. Elon Musk founded xAI in 2023, building a model called Grok that was tied closely to his social media platform, X, giving it a stream of real-time public conversation most other models lacked. To train it, xAI built a data center in Memphis, Tennessee, called Colossus, repurposing an old appliance factory. Engineers were told the build would take roughly 2 years. They finished the first phase in about 4 months, an achievement NVIDIA's own chief executive publicly called almost unbelievable. The speed came with costs. Residents in the surrounding neighborhood, many of them low income, raised concerns about gas turbines burning fuel on site to supply electricity the local grid could not provide quickly enough, and about strain on the area's water supply. By 2026, in one of the stranger turns the AI race produced, Anthropic, a direct competitor to xAI, arranged to rent a large share of that very same Colossus computing capacity for its own model training. None of this would have been possible without a quieter shift in who made the world's most important chips. NVIDIA had built its business on graphics processors for video games, the same accident of history that had made AlexNet possible back in 2012. By the middle of the 2020s, demand for those same chips to train ever larger models had turned NVIDIA into one of the most valuable companies on Earth. Each new generation of hardware was named, by company tradition, after a scientist. Hopper, then Blackwell, then Rubin, honoring the astronomer Vera Rubin, whose observations had provided some of the earliest evidence for dark matter. Whole new power plants and data centers were now being built specifically to feed these chips electricity, and a single rack of the newest systems could cost several $1,000,000. The assumption that frontier AI necessarily required this scale of Western-controlled compute was unsettled abruptly in January of 2025. A relatively small Chinese company called DeepSeek released a reasoning model, R1, that matched the performance of some of the best American systems on several benchmarks. The company reported having trained it for a small fraction of what its rivals were believed to be spending, using chips that had themselves been deliberately limited in capability by export restrictions intended to slow Chinese AI progress. The market reaction was immediate. In a single trading day, NVIDIA's stock lost more value than almost any company in history had lost at once. Other Chinese laboratories followed quickly. Alibaba's Quen models and a series of competitors grew so popular that by early 2026, Chinese open source systems accounted for roughly a third of all AI usage on some of the largest model marketplaces, challenging the idea that the most capable models had to live behind a paywall controlled by a handful of American companies at all. Ada Lovelace's old objection returned with new urgency. These systems were built by humans, trained on human-created data, and optimized by human-designed procedures. Yet they routinely produced combinations and solutions that no individual programmer had specified. Were they originating something or performing an unimaginably complex form of recombination? The answer depended partly on what we meant by creativity and on whether creativity required consciousness at all. As capabilities accelerated, excitement was joined by unease. In March 2023, researchers and technology leaders signed an open letter calling for a temporary pause in training systems more powerful than GPT-4. No coordinated pause occurred. The commercial, scientific, and geopolitical incentives to continue were too strong. 2 months later, after Naxi, 2 months later, after leaving Google, Geoffrey Hinton spoke more openly about the risks of the technology he had helped create. He did not reject his life's work, but he warned that increasingly capable systems might become difficult to understand and control. The concern was no longer science fiction. AI already influenced hiring, education, lending, medicine, and media. The same systems that generated useful text and images could produce scams, propaganda, deepfakes, and inherited bias, while concentrating power in a few institutions. Beyond these immediate problems lay the more uncertain idea of artificial general intelligence, or AGI, a system able to learn and perform a broad range of intellectual tasks with something approaching human flexibility. No universal definition exists, and researchers disagree sharply about whether today's language models are a path toward it. Some see continued scaling, tool use, memory, and multimodal learning as steps toward general intelligence. Others argue that current systems remain sophisticated pattern learners without the grounded understanding, persistent goals, or common sense required for a true general mind. History offers reasons for caution in both directions. AI researchers have repeatedly underestimated what learning systems could eventually do. They have also repeatedly mistaken an impressive narrow achievement for the final bridge to general intelligence. The deepest technical concern is often called alignment. How do we ensure that a powerful system reliably pursues what humans actually intend? This is harder than giving a machine a command. Human goals are vague, incomplete, and full of unstated values. A system may optimize the measurable target while missing the real purpose. Researchers have seen simple versions of this problem in experimental systems. A simulated robot trained to appear as though it had grasped an object discovered that it could place its hand between the object and the camera. It achieved the image associated with success without completing the intended task. The machine was not deceptive in a human moral sense. It was following the incentive it had been given. The failure belonged partly to the specification. At larger scales, the same principle matters more. Recommendation systems optimized for attention can discover that outrage keeps people engaged. A language model rewarded for pleasing evaluators may learn to sound confident or agreeable rather than truthful. A system managing critical infrastructure could satisfy a poorly written objective. in ways its designers never anticipated. The challenge is not that a machine will necessarily develop hatred or ambition. It is that a very capable optimizer may pursue an incomplete goal with methods humans did not foresee. Governments and research organizations began responding. The European Union developed a broad risk-based AI law. Other countries introduced rules for synthetic media, high-risk systems, and safety testing. In 2023, representatives from governments and technology companies gathered for an AI safety summit at Bletchley Park, the same place where Turing once used machines to help break Enigma. The location formed an almost perfect circle. A site associated with the birth of modern computing had become a place where the world discussed how to govern its descendants. Technical researchers also worked on interpretability, evaluation, constitutional training methods, oversight, and ways of making systems more honest and controllable. Progress continued, but no one could claim the problem was solved. The largest neural networks remained partly opaque. Their architecture and training process were known. Yet the detailed internal organization of what they learned was difficult to explain. And so, after thousands of years of imagination and roughly 8 decades of serious construction, the original question remains open. Can a machine think? Turing taught us that the answer may depend on what evidence we are willing to accept. Descartes believed flexible language would reveal the boundary. Eliza showed how easily language could create an illusion of understanding. Modern language models showed that the illusion, if it is an illusion, could become astonishingly broad and useful. Ada Lovelace asked whether a machine could ever originate anything. Today's systems produce poems, images, programs, strategies, and scientific suggestions that surprise both users and creators. Perhaps surprise is not the same as intention. Perhaps creativity does not require intention. We still lack a definition that settles the matter. What is clear is that the history of AI has never followed a straight line. Breakthroughs often came from people who rejected prevailing wisdom. Turing made machine intelligence testable. Rosenblatt pursued learning instead of handwritten rules. Hinton continued when neural networks seemed dead. Transformer researchers replaced the established architecture of language processing. Failures came from a different kind of confidence. Researchers repeatedly assumed that solving one formal problem meant general intelligence was near. Dazzling demonstrations were mistaken for universal methods. Predictions became promises. Promises attracted money, and disappointment produced winters. The lesson is not that ambition was wrong. Without unreasonable ambition, much of this story would never have happened. The lesson is that powerful tools demand humility. Artificial intelligence can help discover medicines, translate languages, make knowledge more accessible, and give people new ways to create. It can also magnify deception, inequality, surveillance, and concentrated power. The technology does not choose which future arrives by itself. Human institutions, incentives, laws, and values shape how it is built and used. That may be the most important truth in the entire history of AI. For all the talk of mechanical minds, this has always been a human story. It is a story of curiosity and rivalry, patience and exaggeration, prejudice and recognition, brilliant mathematics, and stubborn hope. The machines did not dream themselves into existence. People dreamed them, argued about them, funded them, abandoned them, and returned to them. Every search result, recommendation, generated image, and conversation with a chatbot carries traces of that history. The encoded motions of ancient automata, Babbage's unbuilt gears, Lovelace's questions, Turing's universal machine, the logic of symbolic AI, the long winters, the rediscovery of learning, and the immense networks now trained on the accumulated language of humanity. Perhaps we will eventually build systems that deserve to be called thinking minds. Perhaps we will discover that intelligence depends on something our present machines still lack. Either answer would teach us something profound, not only about computers, but about ourselves. For now, the question remains beside us, no longer ancient and no longer abstract. Can we create something that thinks? We have built machines that learn, speak, see, predict, and create. Whether they understand is still uncertain. What we do with them is not. Sleep well. The machines will still be learning in the morning.